Hello, everybody. I'm Howie Hawkins. I was the Green Party and Socialist Party candidate for president in 2020. And this podcast called Green Socialist Notes is about continuing to educate and advocate for the eco-socialist program that we ran on in 2020. And today we have a guest, Richard Smith, who's going to talk about China's climate policies and problems and how they relate to the nature of the social system in China. Richard wrote his PhD thesis at UCLA on the contradictions of market reform in China. He's the author of the 2016 book, Green Capitalism, The God That Failed, and particularly pertinent to today, the 2020 book called China's Engine of Environmental Collapse. He's a founding member of System Change, Not Climate Change. He's written eco-socialist pamphlets for the Eco-Socialist Working Group of the Democratic Socialists of America. But recently, he's been calling for an independent party in the 99%. And we'll talk about that as well toward the end. So China is topical for us because many on the left in the climate movement are portraying China as a model for the transition to an ecological civilization powered by renewable energy. And they point to facts like China's installed more solar and wind capacity than the rest of the world combined every year over the last decade. It's the world's leading manufacturer of solar technology, wind technology, and batteries. The ruling Communist Party of China has stated since 2007 its goal is to create, quote unquote, an ecological civilization. So some on the left say they can only do this because they have a socialist system. Others, some in the climate movement, say it's a model of green authoritarianism that we need to force through the transition to clean energy. But Richard has a lot to say that adds to this picture and puts a different perspective on it. Like China's been building more coal plants than the rest of the world combined over that same decade. And should we call a police state socialist? Should a country with extreme and growing inequality be considered socialist? A society with 500 billionaires. Is that what a socialist society looks like? And are there drivers of growth embedded in China's authoritarian model that compels that country to continue burning fossil fuels? So, Richard, welcome. And I know you have a lot to say on these questions. So, talk to us about China's energy and climate policies and problems and how they are related to the social and political structure of China.
Okay, thanks, Howie. So what I would like to do is give a kind of brief overview of the systemic drivers in this system to explain why China's consumption of fossil fuels is unrelenting despite having produced, having built the most renewable energy, solar and wind power in the world. And so let me start by, I want to start by discussing the use of fossil fuel. Okay, so my book, China's Engine of Environmental Collapse, opens with a question. Given that the Chinese Communist Party runs one of the world's most ferocious police states, why can't its leaders compel their subordinate officials to suppress pollution, including CO2 emissions, even from the state's own companies? Indeed, recent studies highlight that greenhouse gas emissions from individual state-owned enterprises in power, steel, cement, oil refining, and other industries exceed those of entire industrialized nations. In 2021, China Baowu, the world's largest steelmaker, pumped out more emissions than Spain, the world's 24th ranked emitter. Sinopec pumped out, it's China Petroleum and Chemical, pumped out more than Canada, the world's 11th largest emitter. Huaneng Power produced more than Vietnam and South Korea combined. In his widely acclaimed speech to the UN and General Assembly in September 2020, China's President Xi Jinping pledged to transition to a green and low-carbon mode of development and peak the country's CO2 emissions before 2030 and achieve carbon neutrality before 2060. Since the companies since these companies I just noted are controlled by Beijing, one would think that he'd be able to force them to clean up. Since the CCP bosses don't have to contend with public hearings or environmental studies or recalcitrant legislatures or labor unions or press, he should be able to force state-owned polluters to stop polluting or else, and ram through his promised transition to renewable energy. So why isn't he doing that? Most of the world's leading capitalist industrial democracies have actually reduced their greenhouse gas emissions to an extent. The United States, in 2023, the US economy grew by 2.5%, but emissions fell by 4.1%, and were down 17% from their peak in 2005. EU emissions were down 32.5% from their peak in 1990. Japan's emissions were down 19% from their peak in 2013. By contrast, under Xi Jinping, just as much as under his predecessors, China's carbon emissions have been relentlessly growing, even as the country's GDP has slowed from 10% in 2010 to about 5 to 6% in recent years. From 1990 to 2023, China's CO2 emissions quintupled. China's emissions exceeded those of the United States in 2005. In 2013, they were double those of the US. By 2023, they were nearly triple those of the US. Yet China's GDP was just 65% as large. China's emissions exceeded those of all developed economies combined in 2019 and grew another 15% by 2023. In 2019, China's emissions accounted for 27% of total global emissions. Today, they're 35%. While most of the world is shutting down coal-fired power plants, China is doubling down on building coal, building hundreds of new ones, 2 per week on average in recent years. It's also boosting production and imports of oil and natural gas. Under Xi's tenure, Xi Jinping, China has become the world's largest importer of oil and natural gas. In short, far from transitioning to green and low carbon future, Xi Jinping is developing the most carbon intensive industrial economy in the world. Well, why is this? Paradoxically, China also, as Howie noted, China also leads the world in renewable energy technology. China is by far the world's largest producer and consumer of wind and solar renewable energy. China has built more solar and wind power capacity than the entire world. By 2024, China's wind and solar accounted for 36% of the country's generating capacity, electric capacity. Adding in hydroelectric, another 14%, the country's renewable capacity reached 50% of total capacity in 2024. As against 48% for thermal, that's coal and other fossil fuels, and 2% for nuclear. This was an astonishing gain for solar and wind renewables that should have heralded a future of renewable-led energy for China. Yet this is not happening. The problem is that China's huge solar and wind capacities are not reflected in the country's actual electric generation and consumption. They produce almost trivial amounts of electricity. In 2023, coal, oil, and natural gas accounted for 70% of generated electricity. Coal alone, 60%. Wind accounted for 9%. Solar barely 3%, hydro 13%. So with 36% of the country's generating capacity, solar and wind produce just 12% of its electricity, while coal, with only 40% of capacity, produce 60% of electricity. China's persistent inability to force the replacement of coal with solar and wind renewable energy has plagued renewables since the first solar and wind power plants were built in the country in the early 2010s. Yet the country's inability to turn capacity into generation is unique. This is strikingly evident when we compare China's experience with that of other countries. Compare, for example, the ratio of capacity to generation in China with that of the laggard United States. In 2023, wind accounted for 15% of China's utility scale generating electric capacity and produced 9% of the country's electricity. Solar accounted for 21% of capacity, but produced just 3% of electricity. By comparison, in the US in 2023, wind accounted for 12% of total US generating capacity, and it produced 10% of electric generation. Utility, that's 83% efficient. Utility scale solar accounted for 8% of capacity and produced 4% of the country's electricity, which is 50%, which is hard to beat since the sun only shines half the day. In other words, the US solar and wind generated from 29 to 50% more electricity per unit of capacity than those of China. In fact, I did some research on this, and it turns out that lots of nations, many poorer than China, generate far larger shares of their electricity with solar, wind, and other renewables. In 2023, Brazil, solar and wind currently accounted for 21% of electricity generation, up from almost nothing 5 years before. Chile generates 18% of its electricity with solar alone. Honduras, 12.5%. Australia, 12.3%, Netherlands, 11%, Japan, 10.4%. Norway, New Zealand, and Costa Rica all generate 98% of their electricity from renewables, wind, water, and sun. Sweden, 50%, Germany, 47%, Uruguay, 91 to 95%. Even the US, the world's premier fossil fuel superpower, solar and wind generation surpassed both coal and nuclear in 2022 and accounted for 16% of electricity generation in 23, 4% more than China's. And as we know, the US has no industrial policy to build out solar and wind, barely a little bit under Biden, but really barely the rest of the time. So it's pretty ironic that its anarchic capitalist mode is still was actually cranking out more electricity generation than China's state-led system. So why can't the country, China's government, turn capacity into generation like other countries? I contend that there are two main reasons for this. First is technical. I claim that there are insuperable technical barriers to decarbonizing China's economy and the US economy, for that matter, especially in any time frame that matters for human survival. Let's start with what are collectively termed the hard-to-abate industries that account for about half of China's greenhouse gas emissions. Xi Jinping's first problem is that China is home to the world's largest concentration of carbon-intensive, hard-to-abate industries like steel and cement and coal and many others. At least 47% of China's greenhouse gas emissions come from hard-to-abate manufacturing and other industries, most of which cannot be significantly decarbonized with current or anticipated technology either at all or in time to avert runaway global warming and climate collapse. Steel, aluminum, cement, aviation, shipping, heavy road transport, chemicals, plastics, synthetic textiles, and electronics stand out as very hard to abate industries. Decarbonizing those industries has defied all efforts to date, both in China and in the West. And while scientists and engineers are working on many new technologies, green hydrogen, steel, electric and hydrogen airplanes, carbon capture and storage, etc., commercializing these, where possible at all, will take many decades. As George Monbiot wrote in 2007 with respect to the aviation industry, there is no techno fix. The growth of aviation and the need to address climate change cannot be reconciled. A 90% cut in emissions requires not only that growth stops, but that most of the planes which are flying today are grounded. I recognize that this will not be a popular message, but it's hard to see how a different conclusion can be extracted from the available evidence. Well, that was in 2007. Nearly 2 decades on, the global aviation industry still has no viable alternative to kerosene jet fuel for airliners. But the climate emergency we face today is far more desperate. Hence the need to park those planes and the cars and trucks and cruise ships and container ships and so on is far more urgent. I contend that the only way China can effect the rapid, deep, and immediate cuts it needs to make in carbon dioxide emissions is to grab the emergency brake. Immediately begin retrenching or shutting down the country's thousands of needless, wasteful, harmful, and polluting industries. But suppressing production is the one option President Xi Jinping cannot accept, because those hard-to-abate industries have been indispensable to China's rise and underpin his aspirations to make China great again, to win the technology race and overtake the United States. This brings us to the second reason: politics. What drives China's growth? China is the most complex economy in the world, with numerous built-in drivers and barriers to emissions mitigation. It has every kind of capitalism: state capitalism, joint venture capitalism, crony capitalism, gangster capitalism, regular chamber of commerce capitalism. Roughly speaking, the industrial economy formally comprises the state-owned, state-planned sector with about 50% of industrial output, the foreign-invested joint venture sector, like the coastal enclaves, about 30% of industrial output, and the private sector about 20%. The private and joint venture sectors are, of course, driven by profit maximization, like capitalism everywhere. The government also owns some foreign companies like Syngenta in Switzerland and Volvo, which it runs as state capitalist companies. The state-owned economy has been modernized and partially marketized, but structurally it remains little changed from Mao Zedong's day. This sector operates on different maximans, on five-year and 10-year plans. I contend that China's state-led economic development is propelled by 5 unique systemic drivers of hypergrowth that are different from capitalism, and this explains why it's so hard to suppress CO2 emissions and transition to renewable power in China. First, at the highest level, hypergrowth is driven by Communist Party ambition and fear. Since Mao took over the Communist Party in the 1930s, the party state has been led by a self-appointed elite of ultranationalists. Mao was first and foremost an ethno-nationalist in the tradition of China's 19th century and early 20th century self-strengtheners. They were concerned not merely with modernizing and industrialize their country, but to catch up, not merely to modernize and industrialize and catch up with the West, but from Sun Yat-sen to Mao and Deng Xiaoping and Xi, China's leaders have all been obsessed with one overarching goal: to overcome China's century of humiliation, achieve wealth and power, and overtake the West to reclaim what they imagine is China's deserved pride of place as the premier civilization and culture in world history. In their view, China should be the natural leader of humankind, the rightful successor to what Xi Jinping calls the declining West, because China is a morally and politically superior new type of superpower. Since 1949, China's leaders have also been motivated by a deep fear of capitalist restoration, or even a capitalist takeover of their economy by Western corporations. As a state-based Communist Party ruling class in a world surrounded by more advanced and powerful capitalist nations, Mao and his successors understood, like Stalin before them, that they must overtake the United States and become the world's leading superpower. The Russians' failure to win the economic and arms race with the United States doomed the Soviet Communist Party, and Mao's successors, notably Deng and Xi, have been determined to avoid that mistake. Thus, the leading driver of hypergrowth in China is the party's determination to build a relatively self-sufficient industrial superpower by protecting state industries regardless of their pollution, ramping up import substitution, and achieving technological superiority over the West. Second, China's need to maximize employment to maintain stability, even if this means producing superfluous coal and steel, needless infrastructure, ghost cities, and so on. Maximizing employment is a major driver of overproduction, overconsumption, blind growth, blind demolition, blind investment, and profligate waste of energy and resources across the economy. You've probably heard of China's problems with overproduction and overconstruction, ghost cities, hundreds of electric vehicle auto companies, fierce competition driving prices below the cost of production, forcing companies to flood markets in Asia, Africa, the EU, and the US with ultra-cheap goods, bankrupting companies that become debt-fueled zombies. Since the 1980s, local governments have been overproducing steel, aluminum, glass, bicycles, cars, electric vehicles, apartment blocks, ghost cities, and so forth, and going broke doing it. But governments won't let state-backed zombies die because the government wants to keep people employed, even if the companies make no money. This is completely different than capitalism, but it's a very important driver of Chinese growth. Thirdly, they also need to maximize consumerism. In the wake of the collapse of the Soviet Communist Party in 1991 and the Chinese Communists' own near-death experience with Tiananmen in the democracy protests of 1989, the party resolved to create a mass consumer economy and raise incomes to divert people's attention from politics to consumption. Since the early 1990s, the government has promoted one consumer craze after another: cars, condominiums, shopping malls, tourism, golf courses, theme parks, cruise boats, food delivery, video games, online shopping, and more. After centuries of poverty and decades of Maoist austerity, the Chinese were overdue for improved living standards. But the promotion of mindless consumerism for the sake of consumerism on the model of Western capitalism has contributed mightily to China's and the world's waste and pollution crises. Fourthly, intra-bureaucratic competition drives more growth. In 1992, Deng Xiaoping cut a profit-sharing deal with local and provincial officials, who were the nominal owners, controllers of the state companies, giving them the right to sell overplan and sideline production on the free market and split the profit with the state. He exhorted them to grow the GDP or else. This certainly jump-started growth, providing a wider variety of goods and services. But the introduction of market incentives within the framework of the old bureaucratic system of collective property and surplus extraction also exacerbated many of the irrationalities of the system while adding new irrationalities of capitalism. So in this compartmentalized, particularistic system, the opportunities for officials to boost the income of their counties, municipalities, profits, and also to enrich themselves by legal and illegal means were largely confined to the perimeters of their own bailiwicks. Thus, they found themselves in a zero-sum competition with officials in other municipalities, provinces, and so forth, over markets, over central appropriations and promotion, such that, as one official put it, every locality sees itself as if it's a separate country. This has resulted in GDP tournaments, as local officials competed to boost their growth rates to polish their credentials. For example, the 11th five-year plan targeted GDP growth rate at 7.5%, but all 31 of China's provinces set higher targets. The average was 10%. Competition-driven local GDP growth, in turn, has driven the national GDP to overshoot planned targets. Since 1978, central planners in Beijing have never set growth targets for the country higher than 8% per annum. But that target has been routinely exceeded. In the period 1983 to 88, GDP growth averaged 12%, hitting 15.2% in 1985. And then again, from 1992 to 2011, GDP growth averaged 10%, topping 11% and 14% in the boom, crest of the boom in 2006-07. When government offers new promotes new funds for new industries, the only way for local officials to get their share, so to speak, of this is to do it themselves, DIY. So when government promoted cars in the 1990s, every mayor wanted his town to be a Detroit. So hundreds of auto plants sprang up all over the country, some producing only a handful of cars or even none at all. When in the 2000s, the government promoted solar and wind power, every mayor wanted to become a Holland. Many built windmills, wind turbines unconnected to any grid, just to get the allocations from the state, which they can also spend on, apartments and offices and cars and limousines and so forth. When the government pushed computerization, every mayor wanted to be a Silicon Valley. Xi Jinping complains that today the country is littered with more than a million AI-related industries, more than 500,000 AI companies. But he says most localities have neither the skills, the talent, or technologies to develop such industries. But he can't stop locals from investing in what they figure will be their favored by Beijing, so they do it anyway. And all these thousands and millions of companies can't get bought or swallowed up by larger companies, as in capitalism. So you have this multiplicity of a lot of fairly small companies across the economy, some big, but a lot of small companies, because they're backed by local governments who want the profits and the jobs. So they refuse to shut down, and the government refuses to let them go broke, state-backed companies, because by and large they want to keep people employed. They want to keep the economy going. So even if they're not making any profits, they'd rather have people working than not. And so the government's been trying to suppress what it calls the zombie overproduction of coal, steel, aluminum, glass, housing, cars, AI centers, and so forth for decades. Largely without success. This too is different from capitalism, where, in capitalism, these small companies, the failing companies, would just go bankrupt or lay off their workers and to go starve, and the companies would be bought up by big corporations, but not in China. Fifth, and lastly, corruption is a major driver of hypergrowth in China. Thanks to market reforms, the Chinese government got rich with rivers of cash flowing in from state-owned industry profits and taxes on private industries and trade surpluses and so on. Its $3 trillion foreign exchange hoard is the world's largest. All this treasure is the property of the party state. But individual Communist Party officials have no legal right to any of this. They're legally entitled only to their trivial salaries and perks. Yet, as we know, China's rulers are filthy rich. The Chinese Communist Party members were leaders were the largest single group of the Panama Papers, discovered in the Panama Papers, with their offshore accounts. The only ways local officials can take their share of these accumulated social surpluses that belong to the state are illegal. So they loot the state. Thus, from the princelings down to local mayors and party secretaries, officials have used and monetized their power to loot the state. More than 1 million officials, including generals, admirals, heads of companies and banks, have been prosecuted for bribery, embezzlement, sale of offices, and related crimes. Corruption has also fueled growth, from ghost cities to high-speed gravy trains. An unknowable but no doubt huge proportion of China's overproduction and overconstruction would not have been produced were it not for new opportunities they afforded cadres to steal more. There's just a new big study came out about the overexpansion and waste of the high-speed rail industry promoted by corruption in China. In sum, planned growth targets of the state's planned growth targets of 6 to 8% per year, plus inter-bureaucratic competition to maximize the GDP, plus government efforts to maximize employment and consumerism, plus corruption are in aggregate at least, if not even more powerful drivers of hypergrowth and profit maximization under capitalism. They're different. Very different from capitalism. Those drivers have powered China's growth at 3 to 4 times the rate of growth of Western capitalist economies for the past 3 decades and generated soaring carbon dioxide emissions. an ecological civilization. So I'll stop there and we'll take questions and discuss it if people are interested.
Okay, we're going to put in the program notes some of Richard's writings, and a lot of what he just covered is in an article called "Why China Cannot Decarbonize." So there was a lot of material there and a full argument. And if you go to the program notes, we'll have that article and the link to it. So what do you say to people that say, well, oh no, China is socialist, and that's why they're advancing on renewable energy and toward a ecological civilization? I mean, you've just explained the growth dynamics of this system, but how do we get people like that to like open their eyes and see what's really going on in China, and that we need an alternative to both what China's doing and our Western capitalism?
I don't know. I think that China's done a lot of, pretty obvious. China's done a lot of things right. I mean, they dramatically industrialized the economy. They lifted millions of people out of poverty, though that's much exaggerated because there are also hundreds of millions who are left in poverty. They've industrialized faster than any other economy in the world, except actually not as fast as either South Korea, or Taiwan, or Japan, or Singapore did in the decades before when Mao was running the show. But anyway, they've nonetheless made many huge accomplishments: increased lifespan, produced better food, and housing and so forth. They rebuilt all the housing in the whole country. So this is undeniable. But of course, this is a police state. I mean, Hitler built great infrastructure too, but so what? What kind of society is that? People. I mean, I think that, as I pointed out in another article, it's on my website, but I don't think I sent it here, on Xi Jinping's modernization plans. I quoted a Chinese scientist who said, well, if China is so great, how come people want to leave the country rather than stay here? How come people don't migrate to China? They try to get out of the country. So that's a big problem. You can have a lot of glitzy technology and buildings and high-speed trains and so forth, but if you live in a political system in which people want to escape the country, it doesn't say much for the technology. I don't know. People have to. China is very complicated, very contradictory society. So there's both a lot that's good, but also a lot that's really, really problematical and wrong. It's just, so I don't know. It's a lot of people want to see just the good things and not the bad things.
Well, we're also putting in the program notes your website, and there are a lot of articles on China and climate. So people can spend a long time, reading up on this stuff from you. But why don't we, before we get to talk about independent politics in this country, let's talk about what kind of things China and the U.S. and the world need to do to get out of this climate crisis. I know you mentioned it there that we got to shut down some industries if we can't clean them up in terms of carbon emissions. So talk about, what you think we should be doing, and then we can talk about the politics of making that happen.
Yeah. So in my book, I point out that, and also in this article, briefly, I point out that, I don't mean to pick on China here. It's a different, this is, what I do is I'm trying to do a kind of a scientific analysis of a mode of production theory of China's economy to understand how and why the drivers are different from capitalism, and how that explains problems about pollution and political things and so forth. So that's the purpose of that. But both Western capitalist economies and China's economy are propelled by systemic growth drivers. In capitalism, it's profit maximization. In China, it's mostly nationalist ambitions and fears for the fear of that they have to catch up and overtake the world. So they can't stop producing all this stuff because they need all this stuff. Xi Jinping can't suppress these industries because they're all key to his development and his ambition to become the #1 power in the world. So it's this kind of hubristic nationalism that drives China's development, whereas in the West, capitalist is profit maximization drives our system. But either way, there is no solution to, as I try to point out with respect to the so-called what are called the hard to abate industries like cement and steel and aluminum and transportation, all these sorts of things. There's no shortcut here. We need to, the UN IPCC has told us time and again that we need to suppress emissions immediately. That doesn't mean like you start in 50 years or something, you start in 2060. We have to do it right away. And the only way to do that is to shut down many kinds of industries and scale back many others. I mean, we don't need an auto industry. We need an auto industry that produces cars that can be reproduced and live for decades instead of being replaced with a new model every year with trivial differences. We don't need iPhones. I mean, there's no reason on earth my iPhone 6 or whatever it was, or 3 even, couldn't be used for decades. It just, it's not in Apple's profit maximization plan to make a device that lasts for a long time, for decades. They just want to sell you a new one every 2 or 3 years. And so, we have many kinds of industries that are superfluous, that needless luxuries, the arms industry, repetitive consumption, disposable products, just massive, services and so forth. They're just massive waste and so forth in our economies, both in China and here. And we could live a much better mode of living without all of this overproduction and have a shorter working day and more time for our families and other things if we weren't all slaves to commodification and consumerism and the race to keep your head above water in the economy. So it's just, basically we need to remake the entire economy of the whole world. And whether we can do this, I really, I don't know. It certainly doesn't seem like it's going to happen anywhere here or in China. So I don't know.
Well, before we turn to the party of the 99%, let me ask you one more question. Have you read Alfred McCoy's To Rule the Globe? It's came out in 2021. You may remember him. He's the guy that wrote The Politics of Heroin in Southeast Asia back during the.
Oh yeah, right. No, I know the name. Yeah, but no, I haven't read that book. No.
Well, it's like a history of the rise and fall of empires from sort of a geopolitical analysis going back 600 years. And his analysis is that China will be the next big power, but it's not going to get there because climate change is going to wipe out China. It's going to wipe out, their ability to produce food and, the heat. They're going to lose their cities to global ocean, the ocean rising. So it's kind of maybe a metaphor for where we're all headed. If we
we're all in the same boat, literally, so to speak, because a scientist, I cite a study at the end of my book and also in this article that by 2050, many large global cities are going to be partially submerged, including Hong Kong, Shenzhen, Shanghai, parts of Europe, European cities in Holland, and so on, Florida, the whole panhandle of Florida. In truth, that's right. He's right about that. I write about that in my book. I mean, China has many problems for developing, starting with its patriarchal society that's driving women to refuse to get married and have children. And that's also true not just in China, but in South Korea and Taiwan and Japan too. So they're running out of workers, and they're running out. They're wasting so much of the world's resources to build stuff we don't really need. They don't really need. And the same with the U.S. I mean, both these economies are driving us off the cliff to suicide. So we need to pull the emergency brakes on both. But it doesn't seem like anything's going to happen there until we are really in very bad shape ecologically. So I don't know.
Well, you've been talking about a party of the 99%, the possibility of it here in the United States. So let's, give your ideas about that. We'll also put a link to an article you wrote that was published on system change, not climate change, about that. We need something else to change the policies of our country right now, because Trump is like trying to make it worse, and when the Democrats are in power, it's token at best.
Well, I was supposed to be working on the last chapters of my second book on China in the spring, but as soon as Trump got elected, I was watching the self-immolation of the Democratic Party as they refused to do anything at all, to lift a finger to do anything. I was so furious. I thought, oh shit, I just have to write something up about this and try to think of some alternative. So I sketched out and I outlined and I read your article on the polls that showed how so many issues on all the major issues of the day, the American electorate is far significantly to the left of the Democratic Party. And what's even called the left in the Democratic Party is quite mistaken in my view. But anyway, it's far to the left of the Democratic Party. And and then I was reading Les Leopold's call for a new workers' party, and so I thought, here the Democrats are floundering around. What can we do? And I said, hello, why don't you just look and see what people actually want out there? And if you look at the polls, as you did in your article, if you look at the polls, you can see that on all these major issues, the public wants to. The public wants a whole different program. The polls show that people want Medicare for all. They want a multiplication of the minimum wage, triple or more the minimum wage. They want Social Security expanded. They want public funding of elections, and they want to abolish, by huge majorities, they want to abolish Citizens United and get money out of politics. And on foreign policy, the public is in every poll that comes out shows the public is more and more opposed to Israel and in favor of one citizen, one vote, a nation of whether you're Christian or Jewish or Muslim, one party, one person, one vote in Palestine, and the abolition of the Israeli state. Polls show people are in favor of this. Not so much the question exactly the state. The polls don't ask that, but they do ask whether people support a religious state, and the overwhelming opposition to this in the American public. So, on Israel, on Gaza, Palestine, on democracy, on Ukraine, the American public is way to the left of the Democratic Party on this. So the Democratic Party is I can't help but see it just seems like it's on the road to suicide. So I wrote up an alternative kind of a schematic platform for what people could choose to if they wanted to develop an alternative party. The problem is finding somebody out there who wants to do this. Whether it's this platform or something related to it, but all of those things like Medicare for all and so forth would have to be in any kind of left alternative to the Democratic Party. And it needn't be a full-out socialist platform, which unfortunately I don't think is viable yet. But it certainly could be a social democratic party, and there's widespread sentiment for a new party out there. I mean, people are just fed up with the Democrats. So, so that's why I wrote this. But it's just a schematic sketch of what such a party could be. I don't mean to imply that this is like I've written this program and everybody should join this party. No, not at all. It's just if you're going to build an alternative party, say a party of the 99%, which I think is a good name, but I didn't think of that myself. Other people have thought of that before. I've found out, but anyway, it's in the air these days. And if you're going to build a party like that, it would have to include a lot of those things. That's all. So I think it's possible, but we would need a union or some prominent people to propagandize for this and make it happen. I don't know. I think it's possible. I can't believe everybody's just going to sit around and wait for the Democratic Party to completely collapse. I mean, now their approval rating is at 27%, which is 10% below Donald Trump, even after all Donald Trump's done. So pretty amazing that they could be so bad, but they are, and they refuse to change. Because they refuse to understand what they did wrong. The Democratic Party of today wasn't always like that. Of course, under FDR in the 30s and so forth, it installed a wide range of institutions and laws and policies and agencies and so forth that were to benefit the working class. It created Social Security, it legalized unions, it created all kinds of agencies for like the health, the beginnings of the health system and so forth, national health system and so forth, that were immensely popular, and Roosevelt got elected 4 times because of these. So that was the Democratic Party then. But since the 1970s, it abandoned the working class, stepped back for the working class, and with Clinton in the 1990s with NAFTA and his China shock, they just abandoned the working class. And Schumer said, in 2016, Schumer said, well, for every blue collar worker we lose in Pennsylvania, we'll win 2 suburban Republicans he wants, to win. Middle class suburban. So they abandoned the working class to rebase the party on the professional managerial class and technology and Wall Street, this kind of thing, the capitalists and the upper classes. Well, that hasn't worked out so well for them because those people are not the majority of the country. The majority of the country are working class people. They're more than 90% of the population. And those people have been deserted by the Democratic Party. So that's the first thing. Then his Obamacare policy. Obamacare was just written by insurance companies. That was a disaster for the working class. And people hate that system today. And that was a key argument that Trump ran on against Obamacare. He was going to have something, a big, beautiful alternative to Obamacare. Of course, he never came up with that, and he was prevented in the meantime by the Congress from demolishing Obamacare, which is what he wanted to do. But Anyway, so there was Obamacare, and then the Democratic Party's done even more since. So I won't go into it, but um, that's the that's the that's the trajectory of the Democratic Party these days, and they don't want to re-examine their faults and their errors, and they don't want to change. They just want to raise more money. They think, oh well, it's our ground game. That was the problem, or advertising or something. They don't want to change they don't want to acknowledge that it's their politics that were wrong in the first place, abandoning the working class and medical care written by the drug industry and then all their their cultural politics of scolding people and so forth. Anyway, their elitist attitudes to working class people and so forth.
Yeah, I think that flows from the structure of the Democratic Party today. The corporate donors, which they started going after big time in the 70s, as the labor movement was being attacked. And at one time, labor was an important part of the Democratic Party coalition. I mean, they were never a fully social democratic party, although the New Deal programs were those kind of social democratic programs. In some respects, ours were more advanced than Europe's, like progressive taxation from the 30s until the 70s. I mean, the top marginal bracket for the rich was over 90%, at least over 70% till Reagan got in. And
under Roosevelt.
That started with Roosevelt and was maintained until actually Carter didn't get rid of that part. He started doing some other things that were harbingers of the neoliberalism to come. And then the rest of the Democratic Party leadership are professional, upper middle class folks who basically look their noses down at the working class, and above all, don't want to pay taxes in a progressive tax system so that the rest of us have public services. So I think there's a class interest there against the working class in the structure of the Democratic Party, which leaves this political vacuum you've been talking about. And I think one thing you said that I would underline is that what we need are organizers. You talked about, and we've talked with Les Leopold about this, and I had him on the podcast, and we talked about it a couple months ago. If the organizing it would help if we had a union, a major union, to anchor it with finances and prestige and attention, so we could go out and organize. But my argument is, and people who listen to the podcast know that, well, we can't wait for some union to come forward. We can't wait for some, super rich person because they don't have an interest in it. We're going to have to do it ourselves, which means we got to do it in our communities and build a base there. And then hopefully we can come together. And as I wrote an article about that called Independent Political Action Under Trump. It was in Counterpunch on July 8th. And at the end, I talk about what the leader of Chile, Salvador Allende, said: we have to make haste slowly. And he was basically talking about the race between the mounting threat of a fascist coup from the military and the corporate interests behind it, and it turned out the U.S., and the ability of the movement to build its, base of its own power structure based on neighborhood committees and workers' councils and those kinds of things. And so he was saying we have to make haste, but we have to really build a base. And unfortunately, they weren't ready when the fascists moved, and they got wiped out. So I feel like we're in the same situation.
Yeah, it does. It does feel it's very distressing when you're trying to support democracy and in countries, lots of countries are electing what are essentially proto-fascists. They elected Putin. He didn't seize power. He was elected several times. And Orban and it goes on. So it's not just Trump, but it's quite distressing.
Yeah, it is a global trend. Labor unions and left-wing political parties have hollowed out. They don't have the same participation or size that they used to have. And people are atomized. They're not talking to each other. And grassroots organizations, they're getting messaged by corporate media, including, the social media. And so instead of being able to critically think about it collectively, they're kind of on their own, and people get stuck in their silos and sort of pick their team. And it's not going in a good direction. That's why, I go back to organizing. We got to rebuild those organizations, a left-wing political party, a popular political party, and labor unions and other civic organizations. It's the only way we're going to become smart enough and strong enough to change what's going on.
Yep. But the optimistic thing, I think, is just, it's is that when you look and see what ordinary people's views are, their opinions on these issues, and it just gives you hope that you could organize around that. All these polls I cited in this platform. Support for Medicare for all, support for Social Security expansion, opposition to privatization of hospitals, support for legal immigration, for legalization of the immigrants, the 11 million or so immigrants who are here and have been living here for decades, and so forth. People have always been supportive of. For people who lived here, they came perhaps illegally, but who are we talking about illegally? I mean, Americans illegally took the whole continent. So Trump's a lot of nerve talking about illegal immigration. And we saw after Mexico in the 1840s, they just launched a war to seize the country. A lot of, talking about illegal immigrants, please. But anyway.
Another poll, going back to the climate question, is, people favor a Green New Deal. The polling on that has been consistent since they started polling in 2018. And for most people, that means climate action.
Right.
And so that's an issue where people are with us, not with Trump or, the Democrats. I mean, Biden's climate policy, which he tried to boast about, was really, kind of a neoliberal tax break and corporate subsidy program using market incentives and not using the public sector at all, really. And that's what's needed. We need to use the power of the public sector to really, make the transition from some of these industries that need to be shut down and to other forms of production that will, employ people and also, distribute what we do produce more fairly so people don't have to work all the time. Everybody gets the early Greens had a good slogan called for their first economic program in the 80s into German Greens called "We want a fair distribution of work and free time," I think is the way it was. But it was, it wasn't like full employment, so everybody's working 40 hours. It was like, let's get everybody working for less, but everybody working.
Yeah, I mean, the attitude in France is people want to work to live, not live to work. They want time off. They want a 4-day work week. They're happy with a 35-hour week. They want more leisure time and less consumption. They're just not into it in the way Americans are.
Yeah, I think 6 weeks paid vacation is standard in France.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, that's so different than here.
Holiday, so different from here.
Yeah, I had to work 20 years as a Teamster before the contract got me up to 6 weeks, you know.
Right.
And that's, that's a real good contract compared to what most people never get there.
For most people never get there. Lucky if they get 2 weeks.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
Right. So all of these things that are progressive that we would want, that the polls show that people want, are just opposed by the Democratic Party and by the Democratic Party's funders. So that's why they can't come up with a popular program to mobilize masses of people, because the popular program is opposed to their funders, the interests of their corporate funders and wealthy funders. I mean, it was so disgusting, when even Bernie Sanders, when he talks about the billionaire class, but he's out there supporting Kamala Harris, and she had more billionaires supporting her by far than Trump. She had I forget what the number was. I quoted 52 versus Trump's paltry 37 billionaires supporting her. So,
and she boasted about it. That was part of her message.
And that
turned people off.
Yeah. And instead of talking to workers and trying to recruit workers, she's over trying to recruit never Trumper Republicans.
Yeah.
So disgusting. What a pinhead. That woman hasn't got 2 brain cells in her head. It's just so disgusting.
Yeah, well, I don't think it was. It was more she couldn't do anything else at the top of the Democratic ticket, because that's what the leadership of the Democratic Party wants. So,
yeah, well, program, but if she were a human being, she could have done something else, but she was not.
Yeah. Well,
AOC shut their mouths to back her too. Like you say.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. When I ran in 2020, that's what I was getting. You're campaigning for Trump, and the other side was Joe Biden, and I said he's a corporate militarist. He doesn't. If you use your vote to vote for what you want, if you vote for Biden but you're for Medicare for all and a Green New Deal and all those things, you're getting lost in the sauce. Nobody knows you're for those things. Your vote doesn't say that. So at least use your vote to say what you want. And what we got, Biden won, and we got Genocide Joe. And as somebody said, the choice in 2024 was between fascism and genocide. It was pretty dismal. But as we have been pointing out, the polls show Americans are with us, and let's get out there and organize. Our hour is up, so I don't want to keep you up. We're taping this ahead of time because I got to go to my niece's wedding this coming weekend. But when people listen to this, it'll be at the normal time. So I appreciate you coming on, Richard, and I hope people got a better sense of how the Chinese system works and why it's not the alternative, and then what we need to do here. Build an alternative.
Well, thanks, Howie, for inviting me. I enjoyed it. Okay. Hope it's useful.
Okay.
Okay.
So everybody, I'll be back, next week. I don't have a guest scheduled, so we'll do your, questions and comments. I'll make some comments on current affairs, and we'll have a discussion.
Okay.
So, all right, Richard, let's sign off here.